Francis Levy, co-director of the Philoctetes Center. Dr. Edward Nersessian is the other co-director. And welcome to the future of technology. Now, the art you see on the walls is the remnant of a show that we just had. It was really an exhibition by the Cassisi Children's Home. These were mostly orphan children, some of whom had AIDS, and we had on the 11th, this past Tuesday, a benefit art auction for those children, and these are their works actually, and those, I think those two are by their instructors. For further information about our programs and a complete archive of past Philoctetes programs, and I should, as an addendum to that, say that all Philoctetes programs are recorded, and you can go on the site, you go to past programming, you hit the button, and you can see them all. For further information, to see those programs, you go to philoctetes.org. I'm now happy to introduce David Kirkpatrick, and I will say something after also about Jaron Lanier, one of our panelists tonight, is also a very talented musician. And after the Roundtable, we're going to take a little break, and then he's going to play for us. Correct?
Sure.
Yeah. David Kirkpatrick, who is he? David Kirkpatrick is senior editor for Internet and Technology at Fortune magazine and specializes in the computer and technology industries, as well as in the impact of the Internet on business and society. And I just have to say that he's also a very excellent poet. I know him in other venue. David will moderate this afternoon's panel and introduce our other distinguished guests. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Francis. Well, this is exciting. You know, I've been coming to Philoctetes a lot, and to be moderating a session on something that I know a little bit about, but not nearly as much as our panelists, but nonetheless it's exciting. And what we're going to try to do today is kind of an intrinsically futile thing, because predicting the future in general is impossible, and technology has such an unpredictable set of paths that I think, you know, we're going to be postulating things. But I would say that the group of 4 panelists that we have are unusually, I think, suited to talking about technology in the context of an institute which is interested in how many, many different fields interrelate, in particular the relationship of whatever we're talking about to the mind, neuroscience, psychoanalysis, psychology, human behavior. And I think you'll find, and I hope that this is also an exhortation to the panelists, that, you know, in our discussion today, we really will range widely into the human implications of all this, and perhaps the human limits of some of what we would talk about otherwise purely technologically. So let me just briefly introduce the 4 panelists, and then we'll start a conversation. Maybe I'll say a few more things before we start. Starting right here, Ken Perlin is a professor at NYU in the Department of Computer Science, where he founded the Media Research Laboratory. But he's also done, like all these people, a surprising variety of different things. He won an Academy Award for technical achievement for some work he did with digitization and film. Was that when you were with Greenberg, or was that afterwards?
I did the work before, I got the award after.
And he also has been a featured artist at the Whitney Museum, doing computer graphics. So he's a very broad-minded person for whom the arts are not utterly divorced from technology. Esther Dyson, a very old friend of mine, who is an extremely well-known author, pundit, who for years ran one of the most influential conferences in the technology industry, which is where I first met her, I think, in 1992. 1991 perhaps, wrote a book called Release 2.0 about 6 or 7 years ago that was quite influential on how people thought about the internet at a critical time in its evolution. She's a blogger today and has a blog called Release 0.9. She's very proud of that name. But today she's primarily an investor in technology companies and companies related to technology, including one very involved with health, which she may mention, and is interested in aerospace, does a conference on that, and has written a lot about that as well. Jaron Lanier, it's almost impossible to figure out what to say to describe him. He does so many different things. One thing that I particularly liked that I ran across as I was preparing today he's been working on a book, which I guess is now handed in, which used to be titled Technology and the Future of the Human Soul, which I thought was really an apt title for this session. But he said he's changed the name to the Technology Personhood, which is also an interesting...
Of personhood.
A technology person.
No,
The technology of
personhood.
personhood.
Of personhood. My apologies. I didn't write that down accurately.
But I'll consider the other options there.
But I think I actually like the other title better, but that's okay. But Jaron, you know, he's probably most famous for having been really the first virtual reality guy, having coined that term, created a company way back when, which was involved with things like gloves that would give you a way to interact. Really, interface, new kinds of human interfaces is one of his great, long-standing interests. And even if you look at, say, the Apple iPhone today, and the interesting thing they do with the two fingers so you can expand that's probably one of the most revolutionary things about that. That's the kind of thing, that's an interface invention. That sort of thinking is really a big part of what Ken thinks about, what Jaron thinks about. That's a very probably primitive example of what they think about. But it's an example of how human interfaces are evolving, and that's something that you guys have talked about a lot. He's currently also a scholar at large for Microsoft's Live Labs, which is a part of Microsoft that tries to understand how kind of cutting-edge internet developments relate to Microsoft's product line. And he's especially relevantly, I think, for some of the things we'll talk about today, a science advisor to Linden Lab, which makes a Second Life, the virtual reality world. Finally, Bernie Meyerson has been at IBM since 1980. He's now chief technologist at IBM Systems and Technology Group, and has, as you see in the bio, a lot of patents. He travels all the time. He just came back from 2 weeks in Asia. Most of what he does today is sort of serve as IBM's interface with other companies with which it's talking about doing deals. He's negotiated a lot of those deals, including, he was saying earlier, the one that led to IBM building the chip for the Microsoft Xbox, which was one of their more successful partnerships, I think, since that's a pretty hot product. So anyway, that's a little bit of background on those people. You know, I was just going to quickly sort of summarize some of the things that were in the blurb that I wrote to describe this panel, because you know, I'm an information technology guy. What I try to think about is how computer technology is affecting that industry's evolution, but also media, telecommunications, and a lot of other things, but particularly those two. There's a big set of changes that we're in the midst of right now, and there's so many different converging industries that it's actually very hard to predict where it's all going. But I think the unifying strand throughout most of the big changes is the internet, which was kind of a progression of a lot of other technologies, but in the last 15 or 20 years, this ability to have a global network that connects everything and everybody increasingly on a truly global basis is something I think fundamentally new that I hope we will explore the implications of at some length in the next hour or so. Somebody said something? So we said the title "Future of Technology." Like I said, my bias is information technology. As Ken said when I was talking on the phone, you know, the air conditioner is a critical technology that changed society. If we didn't have that, we wouldn't have high-rise buildings. We're going to try to stay away from technologies like that, but technically we could get into that, given the name of the title of the panel. And the other thing is, in my opinion, because technology is so completely interwoven with modern life, you know, it's hard to really talk about the future of technology without talking about the future of how we live. And that would be, I think if we shed light on that, in the end, that will be our greatest success today. So I wanted to just start with Ken to ask him, you know, when you think about where technology is going, and I know you also have thoughts about, you know, the limits of what's possible given human society's decision making. Talk a little bit about how you see society's views toward technology changing, And what are some of the near-term changes in technology that may cause our lives to be different?
Wow, that's a broad question.
You can take it any way you want. I can refine it for you if
Yeah,
need be.
okay. Oh, gosh. The thing that I said to you on the phone when we had that great chat yesterday was that the best way, I think, to answer those kinds of questions in the context of any given time of history or any given set of technological changes is to look for patterns in how people generally respond when there are disruptive technologies. And I call things disruptive if they make any sort of, they push for any sort of significant change in the political sphere, the social sphere, the economic sphere. You know, entire industries rise and fall based on when an electric motor gets invented or becomes cheap, or an LCD screen, which is what's happening now, and one of the things happening now. So, so my view of it is that there is this odd kind of shakeout period where people don't know what to make of things for a while, and then they get very focused on this new thing, and it becomes, oh my God, there's never been like anything like this before, and society will never be able to go back. And then what happens is everyone kind of gets used to it, and then we're on to other things. So it's really hard to be looking objectively at the things that are making industries rise and fall at the moment, because we have this whole emotional thing going on. You know, there's like everybody's got their iPhone, and the web is rapidly changing from what we thought was going to be this document sharing thing to something that's really more of a conversational chat space. I think it took over a decade before people kind of figured out that everyone just kind of wants to hang out and talk. Which is really, I think, why these things like Facebook and MySpace and all this is really taking off, is it's tapping into even more fundamental, older human forms of communication that existed before we had writing. I'm just throwing stuff out into the group conversation, and you're talking back to me, and we're not thinking too much before we're talking. And I think that's part of what's great about it. And people are very alarmist about that, because, oh my God, I'm talking in front of millions of people. But again, just as has happened with previous technologies, I think when I mentioned to you when we were talking yesterday, is there was a time when if you, in the early days of sound recording, if you made a change to a sound recording to make it sound like someone had said something they'd never said, and then you played it on the radio, it would be a scandal, because everyone would have thought, oh my God, that person said that, and now what happened? You know, and then of course we have in different media, we have War of the Worlds, you know, is a perfect example of radio with Orson Welles, and then that happened with photo retouching, and eventually people realized, well, if it looks like, you know, somebody said something they never said, it was probably some kind of wacky technology intervention, whatever. You know, and then all of the issues about is that real or not all moved to other fora that had nothing to do with detecting things technologically. And I think with some of the new things, we're still enthralled to what's going to happen when this or that and the technology becomes undetectable, and everyone thought I said that on my blog. And you realize it just, at some point it all matures, and people come up, bless you, and people come up with other ways of working out the issues. And so I think to set the tone for all of this, I'd like to start out by saying it's really useful not to be exceptionalist about our time too much, or too alarmist about things that people haven't adjusted to yet, because they will, and then it'll all become boring with these things, but then there'll be something else everyone's going to get all excited about. So maybe I'll just start things off with that.
No, that's not a bad way to start things off. I mean, yeah, so let's go to Bernie. And you know, you're with what until recently was the world's largest computer company. Still close, but that was by choice when you sold off the PC company. And you know, you make a lot of computers, which is the part that you're most closely affiliated with, the hardware part. Given your work at IBM and your own experience traveling the world, what is it that you see coming in the near future, and maybe separately in the more distant future, that this group might not expect?
Again, it's like meaning of life, 42, and we'll just cut it off there. What you're looking at is a bit of a revolution. I sometimes phrase it. I have a video that I show which covers this whole subject on the topic of hair. What I'm referring to is if you look at any of the video games that come out nowadays, PlayStation 3 as an example, all of a sudden people have hair that moves. You know, it's not like me where you shoot me out of a cannon, it stays in place. This stuff actually flops. It's physical. Now, that doesn't sound, you know, like an epiphany until you actually think about what computational horsepower it takes to make hair move. It's a nightmare. It's a physicist's nightmare to get hair to go. No offense. But, I mean, we're talking about... Now, the thing is, it's a game. This is on a game that can make hair move. That's basically supercomputer in a box and it's got to fit in the power of a light bulb. And now you go forward just a couple of years, you squashed it down to the power that's not much beyond what you find in a kid's bedroom. And now think about what it means when you have a supercomputer in your pocket and infinite bandwidth. Well, there's good news and bad news. First of all, you have pervasive access everywhere to any imaginable kind of data you want. Video, audio, it's unlimited. Take that as a given. That's done. I mean, because we can pull that off right now. I could equip everybody in the room with stuff, go outside, enough computing horsepower to choke. Now, the good news is you can get all the data you want, blog with anybody anywhere in the universe. I don't mean just on Earth. We could uplink you and have at it with a space lab. But the flip side of the coin is other people see what you're doing everywhere, anytime, analyze it, know everything there is to know about you that you put out there. And a bunch of things you may not have put out there, from the cameras up here, from the cameras in the trains. So life gets
You mean things that were put up for you without your knowledge?
You bet. And so what starts to happen is you have no privacy. It's not that somebody's spying on you. You just cease to be a private entity because there are literally tens of thousands of ways society in general can check on you, both the good and the bad and the ugly. It gets interesting. And so what's happening is, and what I don't think people have fully appreciated yet, is you will become a public persona. You know, people say, I don't want to go into politics because I don't want to live life under a microscope. Guess what? The folks sitting behind me are on that camera, and we can basically pull that image up, do anything we want with it, and broadcast it globally in a matter of a couple of seconds. So you are no longer private individuals in the sense that you felt that you were, not literally a couple of years ago. So it begs the question, how far do you want that to go? We've already let it go. That's done. By the way, that's old news. So now you go to the really next stage and say, okay, what next? And if you want to go to the next level, we had a bunch of kids called Extreme Blue, university kids. We said, look, build a company, a product, one product. You got to pitch it to a venture capitalist. You got to pitch it in 30 seconds. And here's where I'll stop. Their product was human augmentation, which is a la the Matrix. Just plug me in. I don't want to learn this stuff. Just hook me up. Not only don't they mind not being private, they want to be part of the web.
How old were these people?
They were typically aged 20 to 25. And what stunned me is we had a random group of about 100. Two of the teams, 20 kids, said, yeah, this is a great idea. That was their number one idea. From a cold start. We never suggested a thing. So think how far that takes it. We've just gone from everybody's a politician, which may be some truth in that, to I'm going to be a persona plugged in and attached all the time, on all the time. It's an interesting segue. You're crossing an incredible divide when you get there. So, you know, that's all feasible. I'm not sure how well the plug-in works yet. Well, that's got some ways to go.
But something Bill Gates has predicted since his first book was that we would get there, and I think he still believes that.
Yeah, and I'm seeing, when I was in Singapore last week, I sat in a lab, and somebody who had lost a limb was sitting there and doing a damn fine job, frankly, with a set of biosensors, essentially manipulating the limb, not off the residual neural activity in the limb itself, but just essentially, you know, motor control through direct brain indicators. So it's coming.
And this issue of relying on technology for our behavior is really becoming so routine. I think Google is the way that's easiest to understand that. I'm at the age when easy to forget things, starting to. But you don't need to remember a lot of things you used to need to remember if you've got a computer nearby. You know, all you have to do is, what company did that person work for? And you get their name within 10 seconds on Google. Or the book that Jaron is working on, or whatever. Anyway, Jaron, so Oh, by the way, any of you, whenever you hear anything you disagree with or agree with,
now you tell them.
No, I'm saying,
You saved the two of us, all right? But you weren't.
they'll have their chance too.
There you go.
Everybody's going to get their chance. We got a lot of time here. Don't worry.
He was embodying exactly the tone of alarmism that I was warning you about.
I know. Well, I want you to. So
Go for it.
I'm so looking forward
Come
to
to that in
Yeah.
1 second. All right. But now it's Jaron's turn to say whatever he wants to say.
Well,
and then I can disagree with them all.
Please.
Okay.
There you go.
and I would expect you to. There are so many ways to approach these hugely unbounded topics you've given us, and usually I have a few different spiels that I might use as starting points, and I've been very interested on, well, the future of personhood and what it does to us if we're all assembled into crowds all the time on Facebook-like entities and all that. But given the location and the legacy of this particular place, I'm going to take a neo-Freudian tack instead, and I'm going to improvise this. So this is going to be a brand new spiel just for this event. And
We
so,
deserve it, so go right ahead.
what I'm thinking about is neoteny as a framework for thinking about internet culture. And I will refer back to the early years of the virtual reality craze in its first incarnation, which was in the early 80s. And back then, I used to... That's a good sound.
Sounds like one of your instruments.
Yeah.
I used to give these raps about virtual reality, and we were all so excited about these things at that time that it was just this electric experience to just think about these things and share wonderment with each other. And one of the things I used to think about was a way in which you could imagine the future evolution of virtual reality as being a neotenous process.
What does that
neoteny?
mean?
It's an extended qualities of the early stages of an organism into the latter stages of an organism. For instance,
right.
the human species is considered to have a high degree of neoteny because our babies are born unable to fend for themselves and still have in order to allow our big brains out through the passage to life from the womb, we have to be born a little earlier than we're really ready for, and then that's one aspect of neoteny. And then it turns out the development of human children takes much longer than it does for other species, and so that's neoteny. Yeah, pardon me. What?
No, I was confused
It's Joe
by Joe
Ito's
Ito's
company name also.
Oh, well, that's true.
Interestingly.
That's true. Although I thought he pronounced it neotiny.
No.
But at any rate, I don't know, actually. I always thought it was neotiny, and it was a pun on neoteny.
Well, go back to what you were
it's
saying.
spelled with an E, but
That's what he said. Anyway, so here's one of the raps I used to give. Let's imagine that you could think back to your toddler years and you could really remember them. There was a moment that probably existed for you, and I have a little daughter now, so I'm able to observe this, and I'm beginning to think that the old stuff I used to say might actually have some truth to it. At the time, I couldn't have known, of course, but perhaps I still don't. But here's the sort of guess. Let's suppose you're a little kid and you're just growing up and you're toddler, you're starting to understand you can manipulate the world, and there's this amazing moment of transformation, which is actually a horrible moment. Prior to this moment, you've started to be able to imagine things. You can conjure. You first start to perceive the world, then you can conjure it. And there's a funny thing about being able to have an imagination, which this place studies, I guess, which is that a naive imagination is like being the ultimate superhero or being sort of a god, because imagining is the same as reality, right? So if you can imagine, I used to come up with these crazy scenarios to give examples, like you're a flying golden platypus a mile across, hovering above Manhattan, looking for a good deli or whatever. So you imagine this thing, and it's as if it's true. And then there's this moment in childhood development. It's actually not one moment. It's an extended horrible moment, which is most of childhood probably, in a sense, which is where you discover your personal limits. And you experience the ultimate possible demotion from being godlike in your imagination to being this helpless pink thing that wets itself in reality. So what could be a greater demotion, what could be a greater fall from grace than to realize your limitations? And then accepting that state of affairs, that you're limited and you have to use you have to use your craft and your cunning to get around that in order to do anything, is what constitutes the process of becoming an adult. And it's a difficult ongoing life process. I don't think I've quite made it through. I work on it though still. And so the notion was that in virtual reality, because you have this interesting combination of qualities, no, I should say in hypothetical really good virtual reality, which doesn't really quite exist yet, in hypothetical eventual really good virtual reality, which many of us are trying to build, certainly Ken and I have talked about these sorts of things a lot and tried to come up with the right gadget strategies and all. But hypothetically, you could have a world that is shared, like the physical world, where things that happen are really co-perceived by people to the same degree they are in the physical world. It's no longer just symbolic exchange like in novels or something or on the web. But at the same time, it's under your control, so it's this kind of concreteness that has the same fluidity we associate with the internal world of imagination and dreams. So, shaking up a waking state shared dream. All right, something like that. That's the sort of the notion of an ultimate virtual world. We certainly don't quite have that. The easier part of the problem is how to get the effect, the shared immersive world. But the harder part is the software of how we'd actually be able to quickly express what we want to happen in that world. So, but let's leave aside the technical challenge and whether it's feasible. Those are very interesting questions, but they're complicated questions. Let's suppose it is feasible for a moment. Well, then you could imagine the existence of that sort of technology as being like an extension of childhood into adulthood. Or another way I used to put it is it's a permission to experience childhood within adulthood. Right. So these are ideas that are vintage a quarter century ago. This was the rhetoric of early virtual reality. And we needed a lot of this rhetoric because what we could deliver was somewhat limited. So the rhetoric was important. What I have been thinking about lately is looking back on that early rhetoric and reconsidering it as in the light of what's actually happened online. And I think that this neoteny as a framework actually can apply pretty well to understanding present-day internet culture, to the degree anything can serve as a framework, because of course it's a varied and quickly spreading and very hard to capture and understand phenomenon. But I think the first thing is that at that time I had an overly rosy and unrealistically positive view of what childhood was all about. And in fact, even with the whole idea of demotion and everything, childhood is actually also quite dark and cruel and mean. Along with it's a mixture of things, but there are, and I think if you were going to try to characterize what does the internet feel like, if you look at the style of interactions that happen in blog rolls, if you look at people's at the most popular internet-only sites, the Boing Boings of the world, and if you look at the nature of, is this me squeaking? I don't know. If you look at the Facebooks and the MySpaces and the Twitters and the I could just start making up words and they probably would correspond to funded startups. The Blimboos. I'm sure it's something that Kleiner Perkins is.
Somebody has the URL,
Yeah.
Well, they will before this is over.
Yeah. So, if you look at those things and you say, a very nice way to understand it is to think of it as extended childhood for adulthood. There's, first of all, there's a intense fascination with childlike concepts, things we associate with childhood. They might not necessarily in some absolute sense be childlike from any perspective at all, but for the people who enjoy them, for instance, there's an intense nostalgia for basically the materials of childhood, the TV shows you grew up with, games, silly things, in an endless mashup, which just that framework explains almost all the content on Boing Boing that isn't open culture promotion. I mean, it's a remarkably efficient summary. So I've begun to think that old rhetoric has actually been realized if you take into account a more realistic nature of childhood.
And to add the future spin, you're saying that will be accentuated as time goes on in your opinion?
I haven't gotten to the future. I'm just...
Well, get there.
Well, Yeah, can I suggest? I've talked for quite a bit now. Why
Okay,
don't
we
leave
can
the
come back
future
to it.
for another
Just
little.
tie it in later.
I'm
That's
very
fine.
happy to talk about the
Fine.
future, but I'm thinking maybe I've done a nice little segment here.
No, it was an
I'll come
interesting
back
set of
to
thoughts.
it.
I wanted to just say, I'm sure there are not that many people in the audience who've been inside Second Life. I don't want to embarrass
Why don't you
anyone.
ask?
But
Yeah, how
Shall
many
I say-
people have
how many
Second Life
people have been
avatars?
inside Second Life,
may
actually
be surprised.
traveled around in it.
And how many
Yeah,
of them
like
are
5%.
are vaguely sort of like loose babe characters?
How many of you roughly know what Second Life is?
Oh, come on, be honest.
So the reason I mention that is that Jaron is an advice. A lot of things Jaron is just describing, I think, are kind of realized to some degree or exemplified by Second Life, which is a online virtual world, a 3D space that you can enter as yourself or as any kind of persona you'd like to adopt. And you really move around inside what feels like real 3D space, although at the moment it isn't really connected to the sort of virtual interface devices that Jaron used to work on. That will happen in the near future. It has audio, directional audio, so you can talk to someone in there and they can talk back to you. And the way it really works right now is that typically when you're in this world, the people on either side of you are from Japan over here, Brazil over here, and Norway over here. And so in fact, you're in sort of this truly global space, which I find especially interesting, although it's not directly related to what you just said. But it is a complete fantasy space in which you can construct anything you'd like. And there is certainly a school of thought that this is where a lot of computing is going in the sense that 3D interactions with highly manipulable spaces will be a bigger deal as time goes on. And it's also relevant because IBM, where Bernie works, has made a huge bet that this is a big deal. And I think there's how many thousands of IBM employees that are regularly inside Second Life now?
I don't know. I know if you start looking at any of the social networks, you'll find tens of thousands. Not
I think in
numbers.
IBM there's at least 40,000
Yeah.
who are frequently inside Second Life, and there are probably 5,000 who are there as part of their jobs. Because IBM
reasonable number.
owns a lot of real estate in there and
Yeah.
is doing a lot of work for clients in there, et cetera.
Yep.
So, and it has a lot of childhood-like qualities. Anyway, Esther, do you need a question, or shall you just...
No, I'll because I actually teed up what I'm going to do quite briefly and quickly. And the first is to talk about Facebook and disagree slightly with, I think it was what you said. Then I'm going to talk about space and the actual experience of weightlessness as opposed to in Second Life, just as a little vignette. Third, I want to talk about genomes, which is the main thing I want to talk about. And then fourth, I want to ask a question about virtual reality, to which I'd really like the answer. And it has very little to do with the 3D space and everything to do with the psychological experience. So first of all, to me, I don't think Facebook is as much, and I'm not trying to do the exceptionalism, but I think what's interesting about Facebook is not that it's a real-time conversation, but it's sort of something else. And I owe this precise notion to another guy, but if you look at one of the great urges of humankind or of any living thing, it's to spread your genes and your DNA and to have sex and have your genes be all over the place. What Facebook and other things are allowing you to do is to spread your virtual genes. It's your name, your presence, your photos, all over the place, not necessarily in conversation, but just to multiply your presence. It's really intriguing stuff. And you could argue that it ranges from bizarre or novel to obsessive and weird. How much is it learned behavior? How much is it something that's innate? We just weren't able to do it before. But it's really intriguing to watch how people like to spread themselves everywhere.
Can I just quickly define Facebook for those who might
sure.
not know it? Facebook is what they call a social network. Individuals have their own homepage, in effect, with a lot of data about themselves. And there's all kinds of different communication tools. But basically, the service's software essentially projects data about you to other people in the service, which is basically where Esther's taken.
So how many of you are on Facebook? That's another. Okay. So you didn't even need to tell them.
No, a lot of them didn't raise their hand.
Some of them didn't. But
My cat is on it.
your cat. Good.
Not me.
And of course, it's not just Facebook. It's all these other things. Whether you post your photos on Flickr, or you broadcast your activities on Twitter or whatever. And now I'd lost my train of thought, but I'll come back to it. So, oh yeah, the other intriguing thing about privacy is I would argue that we're really talking about something different. It's not privacy or lack of privacy. What Facebook is teaching us, and I mean Facebook generically, beyond the projection of self, is control of the information. And yeah, there are video cameras watching me, but I'm also getting into the habit of being able to, even though people are projecting about me everywhere, and I think you just get relaxed about that. It's not like being a politician unless you are truly famous. But you begin to expect to say, well, this person can see this and that person can see that. And I had an interesting experience, a very nice segue. 3 weeks ago, I took my stepmother on a weightless flight. It was really nice. I have a complicated family history. I'm sure you'd all be interested. And I bonded with my stepmother. It was really great. The experience of weightlessness, for what it's worth, does not feel strange at all. It feels normal and familiar, and when it's over, you want it back. Precisely because it didn't feel special. You want to know, well, why can't I just jump up in the air and float around here? But as we were chatting, as this thing was over, I was thinking, this was really so nice. I'd love to post the pictures of me and my stepmother on Flickr. But then my mother will see them, and that will upset her. And so it's not really privacy. It's control. It's designing information access the way you want it. And that's what people are learning. So my big point is to talk a little bit about sequencing of genomes. And here I'm going to do what David's been trying to do, which is explain what it is I'm talking about. And
why it's relevant to this.
And why it's relevant, yeah. So 2 full disclosures. I'm a member of something called the Personal Genome Project, which means that I am posting my almost entire genome, which of course is just a meaningless sequence of letters, and also my health records, which are much more meaningful, up on the internet for anybody to see. There are 10 of us doing that, and so we join esteemed people such as Craig Venter and James Watson. And the purpose of this is not, or so we kid ourselves, self-aggrandizement, but rather to prove that it's not dangerous. My genome is not something that if it's up there, people can stick pins into it and cause me harm. It's not going to, I'm not disclosing anything that's secret or private, and other people's mileage may vary. I'm not suggesting that everybody should do this, but the genome itself isn't inherently that interesting. It's going to get a lot more interesting 10 years from now when there will be millions of genomes that people have looked at and have been able to associate with diseases, perhaps character flaws, perhaps innate kindness, who knows what else, combinations of genes, not single genes by and large. And so again, the more interesting part is the health records, which were much harder to get, incidentally. I just gave blood to get my genome. My health records is a real struggle. Second, I'm involved in a company called 23andMe, which offers a somewhat, let's say, less complete service that will sequence, I think it's 500,000 SNPs, single nucleotide variation, whatever's. And so you'll get this data, and 23andMe will also help you to understand it. Most of it, of course, is still not meaningless, but its meaning is not known. What makes it interesting, honestly, there may be 14 interesting medical things. We're not marketing it as a healthcare thing. We're marketing it as a self-exploration thing. It's most interesting when you say, oh, gee, I really resemble my mother, or look, little Susie is just like Big Bertha, or so what you want to do is get families to do it, which of course is great for marketing as well, because 4 people spend 4 times as much as 1 person. It's, again, like a lot of what we're talking about here, fairly sort of self-involved, almost narcissistic. but at the same time, really interesting. I've now invited the 25 people in my family to do it, and they seem to all be signing up. There's some questions about the ex-husbands and so forth. But so the questions that this raises are a couple. First of all, this stuff is really dangerous if you don't understand statistics, and most people don't. A single gene variation is not destiny. 5 or 6 genes interact. We may know 3 of the genes. There may be 4 others that we're not aware of that actually influence something or other. What you find out is not just, are you going to get such and such a disease, but how good are you at metabolizing a certain kind of drug, which particular kind of cancer do you have, and therefore what might be the best treatment for it. And of course all the other interesting things that are not really medical, like what kind of muscles you have. Do you have hemangiomas, which are these little sort of blood birthmark thingies? And then the other question that really intrigues me is if you look at your genome and you discover that you could probably live 10 years longer if you ate more broccoli and exercised more or didn't smoke, will it make it easier to do so? If you find out you have a tendency to alcoholism, which you probably knew already because of your parents, does it mean you're going to say, oh, well, I might as well just get on with it and become a drunk? Or does it mean you're going to get better at controlling your alcohol intake and then actually fight back? And does the more specific knowledge make it easier than, I could probably look at many people in this room without even knowing their genomes and give them useful health advice. So what are going to be the implications of this kind of self-knowledge, which I think is inevitable? Then separately we can talk about health insurance and lots of interesting political things. But the basic message here is that I think within, 20 or 30 years, it's going to be probably pretty standard to know your genome, and it will also, knowing your genome will tell you a lot more than it does right now. And then my final question is about virtual reality, and it's this. The one that I think we mentioned just in passing is World of Warcraft. It's a wonderful game, and it happens in one of these virtual reality spaces, and there are dragons and all kinds of things. But what's really interesting about it is the social interaction. I had in fact, my very last conference, we had a 23-year-old woman who was talking about it, and then this 8-year-old kid gets up and says, so I'm level 41 and I want to know what it's like at level 51, or something like that. I don't play the game, as you can probably tell. And she answered, and the kid was going to sit down, and I said, no, stay there. So you're 8 years old, and you lead raids, you plan campaigns, you collect resources, you design strategies. How do you get all these other people to follow your leadership? And he said, well, it's a lot easier if I don't tell them how old I am. So there are 2 really interesting questions. What is the impact of being 8 years old and being able to operate like an adult online? It's one thing to be able to watch adult TV and I mean not just sex TV, but world news, and when you're 8. It's something quite different to be able to lead a team when you're 8. And the second question, which is a really important business question, is why is World of Warcraft fun? And why is gaining a point of market share for Coca-Cola considered work?
Wow, you really got a lot of stuff in there, Esther. But I'd say, just having heard all 4 of you, the kaleidoscopic set of implications of technological change, I think, are on display, which is why it is a hard topic. But you have something simple to disagree with him about?
No.
No?
I have something to disagree with him about.
Well, disagree with him anyway, then.
I mean, it's not simple.
I was joking anyway.
Oh, yeah. Okay. All right, so Yeah, this whole notion that technology will change everything, which is pretty much what I started out saying is not the case, and then you took the perfectly opposite
right.
position. And so I'm thinking, at any moment now, in the middle of this conversation, anytime I want, I could pull out a gun and shoot you dead. I have the technological capability of doing it. And in fact, when you think about it, for thousands of years, I've been able to, across a room, shoot you dead. I could use an arrow. I could throw a knife. Technologically, the problem is solved. You're dead. Why don't I do that? It has nothing to do with technological limitations. In fact, everybody here has locks on your door. And everybody knows that the locks on your door are not keeping people out. They're not designed to keep people out in any definitive way. They're there to sort of be the symbolic marker that, well, if you break this lock, you've broken the social contract. And so now I've got an entire group of people that I've never even met who are going to stand behind me to hunt you down and take you to court and throw you in prison for breaking that lock and taking my stuff. And so I think that the important analogy here is it's never the technology. It's always a group social contract. Yes, technology will allow us, if we so choose, to dismantle privacy. But if we don't choose to dismantle privacy, and my belief is the reason we wouldn't choose to dismantle privacy is heavily informed by the way we evolved as a species over a very large period of time and got to a place maybe within the last 10,000 years where we're pretty much what we were in the late Cro-Magnon. We're not any different in terms of, we love our kids better than everyone else's kids. And when you're in love with someone, they're prettier than anybody else. And there are all these things that we just know, people are religious without absolutely any justification other than, well, I'm religious. You going to do something about it? And just, and most people feel that way. Not the same religion, which is kind of interesting. But so we're just full of all of these human imperatives that predate any particular technology, and then we just evolve social contracts to enforce those imperatives. And I just don't see anything happening that's going to stop us from being people.
So you made an interesting point, but you're stopping the discussion at sort of midstream.
Okay.
When you point out what a capability is brought to you by technology,
okay,
that's not the alarmist part. The alarmist part is if you then assume that this will dismantle privacy. What you have to do, because technology is moving at a pace that's essentially still accelerating, you have to actually look at the consequences of its capabilities and essentially proactively say, okay, I could tell where you are pretty much 24/7, 365 from now on, period. Now, you either accept that and live with it, or you decide that you want to maintain the social contract, which is, I am entitled to my privacy.
Or you don't go around killing each other all the time.
Well, it's same idea.
Technology,
yeah, right. At some point, right.
anything.
So the key though, is then understanding what do you do in the context of this new capability that enables you to maintain your privacy while still maintaining this social contract, which is you don't go around killing each other. It's a very, very delicate balance. It's, for instance, where if you know an individual is dangerous, and you want to track this, and this should not be in certain avocations. Don't let this person near kids. Okay. The problem is, we do have a technological capability to track this individual, but track all individuals for that matter, but you just want to make sure this one individual stays away from kids. So how do you share the information, for instance, about the prohibitions on this one individual globally, or even the suspicions, without broadcasting that information, that negative information worldwide, and perhaps indicting this person forever, where you may not be certain, there may not be certitude, and it gets into a very interesting, conflict between the two.
Yeah,
you want to.
Ken, isn't the point that isn't technology somehow fractured solitudinous consciousness? I mean, isn't that a revolutionary thing? The solitudinous consciousness is no longer. I mean, it just struck me when you were saying that hasn't there been some? Isn't it really a bit dramatic?
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
It fractured solitudinous consciousness, that we essentially, the human being has never been so unalone in one sense because of this rise.
Okay, wait, Esther has a strong opinion about
No,
that.
I think we're sort of forgetting history before 1950 or something. Back in 1800, I don't think anybody had any privacy at all. If you were rich You had a chambermaid who took out your chamber pot. You had people who dressed you. You were rarely alone because you had people taking care of you. And if you were poor, you lived with 8 other people and the dog all in one room. So the only form of privacy you had was private thoughts. And to some extent, that's still what we have. So we had this, in the early 20th century, we had a new form of solitude. The kids started, this was probably not until the 1950s, the notion that upper middle class children should have their own bedrooms was a kind of new idea. Mm-hmm. So it changes over time. And what we think is so natural, in fact, was quite new and novel not that long ago.
But the length scales changed by factors of 10 to the 10th. I mean, it's, in other words, now it's global. You literally have no global privacy, as opposed to personal space. It's a different.
You have privacy by obscurity. And what's interesting is that technology enables you to breach that.
And you have to figure out how will you basically mitigate against that.
Well, maybe you don't want to.
That's your choice.
There's this. You go into your little village and everybody cares about you.
In support of actually what you said before, and sort of sticking to the sort of my same mantra here, I just thought what happened in the last few weeks with Facebook, a beacon, was just so lovely. It was great. It was
might
like
want to quickly say
we all got to see history being made and everything being laid bare. In that, Facebook always had this ability. There was one of the great things is that you could go ahead and talk about, here's my stuff, and I could share my stuff, and this is what I buy with my friends, and everybody got a choice to reveal things about what I like, what I don't like, the music I bought, and everything. And then the founders of Facebook, they got it wrong. They got it wrong. They just said, "Oh, I get it. You actually aren't interested in privacy anymore, so we're going to proactively decide for you that every time you buy something, your friends know what you bought, because of course that's what you want." And then all these people are like, I love the one that they mentioned in the Times, where the woman suddenly saw that her sister had bought the interactive Harry Potter game, and she's thinking, my sister doesn't even like Harry Potter, and she called her sister and said, "Are you getting me the Harry Potter game for Christmas?" And it was just a complete disaster because she didn't want to know, that this was happening. And it goes back to what you say. It's the social contract. It's not about technology. The social contract in this case was, I'm enjoying the shared fantasy of openness, but I want control of my openness, not you, and I'm going to leave your whole make-believe social utopia if you don't respect
Well,
it.
but could I just say, so Facebook is a constrained universe by definition. And in the actual world, given that today any of us could have a video camera on our shoulders at all times and video the faces of everyone in this room, and software more or less now exists that could recognize any of those faces at any time, that I could feed that video freely at my will into a database that was open to the public, and we could basically track anyone's behavior, and that cannot be stopped. I mean, I think that's sort of what Bernie said.
That is technology.
But it
cannot be stopped.
Yes, of course it can be stopped.
Well, it could be stopped potentially
Just
by
as
law.
shooting a gun
Of course it
can
can
be
be stopped. But it's not stopped technologically.
How could it be stopped, Esther? I'd like to explain.
You could make laws
We already
against
went
it.
through this.
I mean, we would have to have a collective will to do that. But just as you can stop him shooting people, and maybe you don't even need a policeman standing here. Maybe you're going to bring him up not to shoot people.
But it's harder and harder to enforce such a law, given that the price of the storage and the price of the processing and the camera gets so trivially low.
It's pretty cheap
forward.
to put arsenic in your drink.
Steve Mann walks around saying he's a cyborg, and everyone thinks he's a charming nut, and says, "Oh, it's kind of cool." And then they stopped him at the border because he was like wearing all this cool equipment, and maybe he's a refugee from Star Trek: The Next Generation or something. And it's really kind of interesting, and he's raising questions, and he's being a performance artist. But if you got thousands of people doing that, at that point the social contract would wake up and start saying, "I'm going to start talking about legislation."
Okay, that may be true, but the fact is, right now we're at a point, as Bernie points out, where the social contract hasn't caught up to the technological capability.
Sure.
Yeah.
And that's all that
I
I'm
agree.
saying.
Right. It's not a question if it won't. But there's a guy who, Jeff Jonas?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so Jeff, then you understand where I'm going with this. Jeff actually realized here's the problem. You have all this data. You want to share it for the, quote, good of society.
Here's the opportunity, he
Right.
thought.
He said, okay, I've got to figure out a way to share the data without revealing that I have this wealth of information about these individuals in my employ. But I do want to compare them here because if they had a rash of thefts or assaults, I want to see if there's 23 companies where this one individual, curiously, was at all 23 of these companies during a period of time, there were multiple assaults on other people that were unsolved. But how do you share that without revealing all sorts of personal data? And so Jeff came up with a really incredibly elegant way, as you're aware, of taking the data, hashing it in such a manner that it was completely anonymized. Nonetheless, you can compare the anonymized records of all these people among the companies. And cleverly, what he did was, first of all, he arranged that you turn this pig into sausage. The good news is you cannot run the sausage backwards to the grinder and make the pig. So there's no way of figuring out, who it was. The only thing you do is you find out that, let's say, suddenly 23 companies find there is one common record. Now, if there's one common record, we go back to what you were saying. This maybe is the mechanism for the contract. You then have to have an agreement that in the event that you have a sort of meaningful hit, you're going to sit down with a very small team of people you have by social contract agreed it's okay to share that data among this small group because there are people being assaulted and killed, and you will find this individual by doing that. And that's where that's where it gets very interesting in society, because that's not even legislative. It's really almost it's a whole new form of social contract, but you've got to have a mechanism because technology moves fast enough that the laws will not catch up. We already can do what I described, and there's nothing out there yet. Maybe in the future there will be.
Here's another really simple example of this kind of thing. In the Netherlands, there's labor unions, blah, 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 are very strong. Yet at the same time, there's a lot of theft. And there's a lot of video cameras. And the labor unions don't like the video cameras because they show when people aren't working. So what they did was each video camera would be divided into 3 streams that needed to be put together in order for the image to be seen. So the video cameras would run along merrily, a computer would be stolen, and then the head of the union, the police, and the employer would all agree, and then they would run the video for those. Yeah. And so, I mean, there are technological plus contract solutions to all this stuff too.
So I have a thought on something Esther said about thinking of evolutionary psychology as a way of understanding Facebook. So evolutionary psychology is part of the vanguard that's sinking the Freudian approach, I suppose. So might not be held in the warmest regard around here.
Freudianism is just part of the evolution.
Yeah. And so here's the thing. There's a difference. This is the sort of difference between memes and genes. That one big difference is that genes are selected within organisms, and if you have a sufficiently mixed and atomized world, like a Facebook or most of what happens online, not quite all, you don't have the organism stage. And without the organism stage, you don't really have higher level selection. You have this sort of mush that sort of averages out, in my sense. And I think that's, so here I'll say the sort of thing that gets me in a lot of trouble in Silicon Valley, which is why we have so much mediocrity and crap online right now, because we don't really have the organism stage. There's the blog roll, but there isn't the novel. There's the Wikipedia article, but there really isn't the essay. I mean, there is, of course, but this is the.
But the particular memes are identified with a person. I mean, the blog roll is a person, and then.
Well, but see, this is where it gets into the thing is that if you have. There's no longer a scarcity of personhood. So when you have these millions and millions of people, that kind of personhood, where there's just a little speck of the person mixed in with a bunch of others, is in a way, I think you might be right, that what is motivating those people on various levels that they might be aware of or not, might be best understood as a sort of evolutionary psychology dynamic. I want to get myself out there. But I think it's a sort of a false bargain for them, because they might have that sensation that they're doing it, but in fact they become lost in this in this gray mush.
And what they really want is to be reassembled in somebody's head.
What they would like is for all the pieces to be reassembled, like the videotapes in the Netherlands, and I don't think it happens very often. And so anyway, the thing I would point out is that the important issue about privacy ultimately is differential of power. And so if you have differential access to information that gives you a differential in power, then that's really what's important. And so Google will show you everything in the world except their search engine. You know, you don't get to see inside that. Why? Oh, because that's where the money is. And so there's this sort of, even as a lot of things are opened up, there are a lot of other things being closed off. And
asymmetry.
And yeah, so, oh, sure, Linux is open, but not our search engine. And all of a sudden there are these walls, like you've never seen walls in all history around certain little things. And so we have huge, huge new asymmetries of access to information, which of course are where the fortunes are created, because that's how capitalism works. Differential access to information creates wealth, unless you blow it like some of us do because we're too interested in other things. So you know, I think that the interesting question about the future social contract is really which information differentials we accept. And right now, the trend, which is what I'm arguing against, is that cultural efforts, music and so forth, ideas and all that, should not be subject to much differential access and should become part of a big mush, which I think is a mistake, because we lose the computational step of being an organism before you're selected, if you want to use a neo-Darwinian framework. But the central routing tools that move all that information around are sort of ultra secret and they're the sacred fortresses that cannot be penetrated. And I think that priority it's making a lot of money, and I'm sort of screwing with my own mortgage to question it, but it's our game in Silicon Valley of the moment. But in the long term, I think there's going to have to be a realignment. I think there has to be some differential access to information, just in order for there to be information processing. You can't have a big averaging mush in order to fight entropy.
Although in support of something, I mean, an aspect of it you didn't talk about is almost 2 years ago, I remember going through that experience of learning about the MySpace page of Lily Allen. Like, which was just even then exponentially exploding. You know, she was this 20-year-old singer-songwriter who couldn't get she couldn't get anyone to her record label to put her record out, so she just put 4 songs against their wishes on her MySpace page, and within a few weeks she had within weeks she had 50,000 MySpace friends. Just grew and grew, and they said, oh my God, and they rushed the record out. And then I remember playing this for my 13-year-old niece, and then checking back within a week later, all of her friends had bought the album as soon as, you know, had linked to it. And this is before the album came out. And then by that summer, she was the #1 star in England. And then, of course, she eventually made it here. And I remember thinking, this was part of the gray mush, is what she was using. Well, no, actually, she wasn't actually using. She was using that equal access to power and letting people vote with their feet, and that was something I thought was great.
But I want to point out a distinction for me between Facebook and MySpace, because to me, I like MySpace a lot more than Facebook, and the reason why is that MySpace still conveys the weirdness of the early web in a Web 2.0 context, where MySpace pages are weird, eccentric. A lot of them don't work. A lot of them are broken, but you get a feeling for the person. So I think, to me, there's a transition in design philosophy between the two, where MySpace is still centered around people, and every time you visit a page, you're in for better or for worse, and you get enough of a sense of the person that you can learn to distrust what's there. But Facebook is much more, it feels a little bit, to me, Facebook feels like the new AOL or something. It's like fitting the world into this Jaron, database.
I agree, but I don't want the point to get lost, which was what happened was the marketplace ended up not requiring a bottleneck of access to power information. Somebody actually could use that level playing field on a really large
Can I just make one caution about this?
Scale.
I love that story, and I love other similar stories. And I should point out that in the early days of the internet, which we're still in, a lot of times anybody coming up with things are working now that won't work so well in the future. For instance, there's a famous case, I forget her name, but there was a woman who just put up a web page early on saying, I got in a lot of credit card debt, would you send me $1, please? And she got out of her debt based on nothing but the novelty of being the first person to have tried it. And so I believe in this sort of thing, and I think it'll continue, but we're also in the early blush where the novelty effect is amplifying it. I don't think it's enough in the long term. I think this is, but go ahead, Esther.
Yeah, anecdotes aren't trends.
Yeah.
They're anecdotes, and they're really cool. But just on MySpace versus Facebook, I think it's a matter of taste, and that's why I think they both exist. MySpace you get a feel for what the person wants to project, not necessarily for the person.
But you can even get a bit of a feel for what they don't want to project,
Sure.
which is what's interesting.
If you're smart. But for better or worse, Facebook is more boring. It's more tethered to the real world. It's more tethered to reality, which may or may not be good, but they're just different.
I just wanted to clarify something, because I think when you were saying before your concerns about the nature of content on the web, one thing you didn't mention is advertising, which is something that you've separately spoken a lot about.
Yeah.
That you feel that way too much of the content is, by dint of being needed to be supported by advertising, is bringing it to a lower common denominator.
Well,
So should we have a law?
In a every time, right? In any market economy, if you want to understand what's really going on, you follow the money. So I mean, and people do amazing things for money. I mean, do you know what gold farmers are?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, these are.
Most people here don't. Gold farmers are people who make objects inside games like World of Warcraft and sell them for real money to other game players, but they are completely virtual objects.
And they run in
And that's a
sweatshops.
very
I mean, they're
big
based on
business, hundreds of
sweatshops.
millions of dollars in real
But-
dollars being generated by that.
People
After I just
also
went,
do
I'm gonna go back
amazing
to the-
things for things other than money. And I think that's something that the advertisers miss. People are not spending all this time on MySpace and Facebook for money. They're doing it for attention.
Well, okay.
And,
Well,
various
that's your
kinds of
hypothesis.
But here's no.
They could be doing it for a lot of different reasons.
Well, okay, but attention is a better word for it than money.
Yeah, well, no, that's
Yeah.
that's not.
Well,
what
they're not getting any money in most cases,
Right,
so
exactly.
they
I
must not
certainly
be doing
wouldn't
it for
dispute
that.
No, all I want to point out is that the new sort of Web 2.0-ish attitude in Silicon Valley is it involves a certain kind of social contract that's being proposed, and under the social contract, a lot of the things that we previously charged for, like recorded music or writing and so forth, should no longer be charged for, at least not typically, because if they flow around, they generate so much quick publicity, and as in Ken's example, that ultimately the authors benefit more. And then this is the open culture idea, and I was very much around at the inception of this idea. There's an amazing history to it. The very first concept of something like the web, well, the very first one was probably E.M. Forster's in 1908 in the Machine Stops. But the first one with any technological proposal attached to it was Ted Nelson's from the 60s and 70s.
You're not counting Vannevar Bush.
Vannevar Bush. Well, Vannevar Bush didn't really quite describe the whole society and how the thing. He was more like
That was in
imagining
the
himself
early
as
50s.
And neither did
Another
Ted
theory.
Nelson.
Well,
He got it fundamentally wrong.
well, see, I used to think that. Now I'm starting to think that Ted is as
You can't
goofy
throw
as-
around these names without defining them, I'm afraid.
Ted Nelson. Oh gosh.
Describing. I mean, it may take
can
more trouble
Google
than it's
them.
worth. What?
They can Google them.
They could Google them if they had their portable computers here, but
You guys
we're
all-
not to that point yet.
Ted is a
Give them
lovely-
5 years and they'll all have a little Google thing right in their lap, I'm sure.
Ted just had his 70th birthday celebration, which is
Yeah.
astonishing, and he's. Depending on how you want to think of history, he's either the first person to describe what he called hypermedia or linked media, or one of the first. And his early conception of it was really interesting because it had an economic model that went with it. And his economic model was that you don't have cut, copy, and paste keys on your computer, even though in practice things would have to be copied in order to make the system reliable. From your point of view, each thing exists once and everything is linked through. So if you quote somebody, you're actually linking back to where the quote came from. And every time somebody accesses that original little atom of material, a penny or a fraction of a penny flows back to them. So there's a massive implicit micropayment scheme where anybody could be wealthy if they make something that's referred to a lot, and nothing's copied and nothing's pirated. And everybody is in the game equally and everybody has an equal chance. Now, that idea of paying for content is widely ridiculed in the Valley. It's considered to have been a mistake, a failure, a path we've learned conclusively should not have been taken, and all that. I'm beginning to think we're screwed up, and he was right. I actually am beginning to like it more and more. But what I
Well,
want to
there
point
actually
out,
are also companies emerging that are attempting to monetize
but see, here's the
things
thing.
that way. So.
Whenever we have to be a little honest about tough choices. That sometimes you don't get utopia where everything is perfect in every way, and you have to accept trade-offs. In fact, no, not sometimes. Always. That's life. And so if let's say one option you have would be exemplified by traditional 20th century American broadcast television with advertising, where anybody can buy a TV, receive the programs and their ads, and the advertising model pays for it. Great. Another model is the BBC in England, where you don't have the ads, and you get. I don't want to say that I like one better than the other. I love Star Trek and I love I, Claudius. I really do. I think they're both great. But to get I, Claudius, if you care about having I, Claudiuses in the world or The Sopranos or anything you have to pay for, which just has a different feeling. It's not designed for the commercial breaks. It's got a more holistic sensibility, and it's got. But it just get
maybe just like Patrick Stewart.
Yeah, but the thing is, in Britain though, there are police who come to your house if you have a TV and you're not paying the right tax for it. Like the payment for not getting ads is police. You actually
there are people who really pay big fines for this.
I mean, the different models can coexist. I don't see we have to have a big moral argument about this.
With advertising. So, I'm not saying it's not a moral argument, but the problem is that in the current climate they can coexist, but only if we make them coexist. I mean, the open culture movement is, which is this incredibly influential political design movement in the Valley, is really challenging it. And so I find myself being one of the few voices in the Valley itself who's battling for. I'm not battling for the abolition of advertising. I love advertising. Hey, keep quiet, guys.
You talk only by yourself. Nobody else, even the other people.
Well, we're going to go to audience questions in just a second.
It's okay.
He's just finishing a thought.
Your comment has been highly valuable so far. So, so the thing. I love New York. This is so great.
Jaron,
we are about due for some audience.
What do you think of the following refinement of what you said, which is that look at Google, look at World of Warcraft. The nature of the service Google provides, that particular kind of service, wants to be, the marketplace is drawn naturally toward an ad model, whereas World of Warcraft wants to be a subscription, not an ad model. In other words, different kinds of content and service, etc. Each sort of naturally, people vote with their feet to pay for it different ways.
This gets to be a really complicated conversation, but what I want to point out is that you're doing this sort of culture-first interpretation, and you're doing a tech-first interpretation, and of course, we all know they interact. I'm sure we're all sort of playing roles to some degree. And one of the interesting things is that one of the things that particular technology designs sort of give off a natural feeling for what the commerce model should be like. So if you have a World of Warcraft, it would be such a pain in the butt to write another client that could work with it that it's just not going to happen. So it creates a natural monopoly of entrance, unlike, say, a normal media player like for audio files or something.
Let's go to audience questions.
David, one thing that Jaron, can I say one? I just like you to simplify one.
You're in the audience.
You said one interesting thing in the midst of this discussion about it's sort of a trade-off. You gain some things and you lose some things. But we haven't really talked about what is technology does things for us. Like you're really big on interrelationship and Facebook and so forth. But the first, we were discussing this on the phone. You go to Facebook, people meet each other through some of these services, and the flirtation is between individuals who are seeking romance is taken care of by these particular kind of computerized intelligences that start to do the work. Just like in early word processing, we stopped having cursive writing. Kids, there's very little cursive writing going around right now because they word process at a young age. But what are we losing through all this technological advance? It's not necessarily. I'm not saying it's bad, but things happen that are trade-offs in evolutionarily. And so that basically speaking, certain aspects of human behavior could conceivably, that's what I took it to mean that you were saying in a certain sense, could be changed or lost due to the fact that you have the advent of a new form of technology taking over that,
I could really drone on for hours on that topic.
I wouldn't mind hearing you. I wouldn't mind hearing you.
Now I do feel, look, just very briefly, I think that this also is a way to answer Esther's question about VR, that 8-year-olds are getting leadership experiences, but they are experiencing them within a world that's simpler. And the question is whether they learn to understand the difference between the two. And so I think in a way what we're setting up is a requirement for another developmental stage, which is a transition from like an early little professor personality to an adult realist or something. And that's a new sort of a new sort of a developmental stage. I've noticed in a lot of undergraduate students from like the last 4 or 5 years who've grown up around internet stuff that they tend to have this sort of quality of, I mean, I love that they're all bright-eyed, but somehow they haven't tasted darkness in a certain way, and there's like a certain kind of weird, like they're inside the web all the time, and there's like almost like a, I almost feel like I want to send them on a wilderness program before they go from high school to college or something. It's like that sort of.
That's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm talking about.
You know, you talk about an immersive experience, but it's childish to even think of it that way in the context of what we're doing here. I mean, you can read people's facial expression. You can actually smell fear. You can, you know, the reason I travel is because phones don't work. Computer screens don't work. Not for the kind of face-to-face, you know, let's get down to brass tacks. And it's fascinating because the closer you get, the worse, you know, the worse the web appears against reality. Yeah. And I was at LucasArts at one point watching how they do, you know, against virtual reality in some sense. As you know, many of the leaders in the movies are not real people. They're just images that they're projecting at that point. You can only get so close, and I don't want to misquote the number. I think it was about 10 feet. Before you look at the image and you just know this is virtual, this is not a person. Well, you know, you're watching the minor facial tics on somebody you're talking to who is highly stressed about a subject, and you can read more into that small expression by the virtue of being there in person than you will ever see in any web simulation or capability today. And what's even worse, with an avatar, you can get rid of the tic. So
what's interesting is how many big technology companies are promoting the notion that telepresence is going to be the solution to travel and energy use. And, but that's
the next can of worms.
Going to what could be lost if they were to succeed.
I just want to pick up on one thing, and then we can really go to audience questions, which is this concept of the possibility of loss, or the reality of it. It's sort of a truism that old people have trouble using computers because they're afraid of breaking something, and the kids all just assume there's an undo button for everything, and neither side really has it quite right.
And I just very quickly, because you know we're going around. First of all, old people used to. Old people used to have trouble using the telephone.
No, I was being really brief.
But those are just different old people. Now we have a new bunch of old people.
Careful.
And I wanted to, so surprise you, I wanted to completely agree with you about something, which was that one of my heroes in human-computer interaction, Ben Schneiderman, who's the University of Maryland, he can be a bit of a curmudgeon, but he said the most wonderful thing. I was talking to him about, with excitement about some new immersive virtual reality thing, and like, hey, you know, and like, look, if we succeed, people are not going to have to get on those stupid airplanes and fly everywhere. And then he stopped me dead. He said, people don't go to conferences to have conversations. He said, people go through all that trouble and get on the airplane because of the danger that they might touch each other. And I was like, wow. It's like our brains still work that way. Like certain things don't wake up unless you know you might touch each other. And I found myself just suddenly, he's right. Yeah. That's not going to get replaced.
It can be augmented, but it will not be
virtualized.
It won't get replaced.
That said, I believe that technologically we will get there, and that'll create another huge transformation of all the things we're talking about. But
and when we do, we can discuss it.
That's another topic.
There we go.
Since you're at the mic, go ahead and say something.
And in physical reality here.
Yeah, and in fact, before we go, everyone who wants to talk, please come to the mic, because people are seeing this elsewhere, and hence you cannot be heard unless you come to the mic.
You can be heard but not seen.
You can be seen but not heard.
Yes, there's cameras everywhere.
A little of both.
There are cameras everywhere.
You can be seen better.
That's fine. I want to go back to the topic of virtual worlds and Second Life, because it's been something that's been fascinating me for a few years. I actually recently, in my old age, went to law school, and I was at New York Law School. I graduated a couple years ago, and there's a very innovative group there running something called the Institute for Information Law and Policy. And in 2003, I was involved with putting on a conference there called the State of Play: Law, Games, and Virtual Worlds. We then had one the next year, and they continue to do it in conjunction with Yale and Harvard information groups. And the first, Linden Labs has been a big sponsor, and the CEO came to and I got exposed to Second Life then, and there were multidisciplinary. This was not just law; it was social psychologists and practitioners and game developers and designers, a whole really interesting group of people. And we talked about the law of the game and the law in the game. And there's, as Second Life has evolved with a lot more going on, the whole issue, intellectual property issues, but specifically legal issues now. You talk about making money from EverQuest or Worlds of Warcraft, where millions of dollars are being made in the real world. You now have lawsuits being brought for violence, for fraud. There's a recent lawsuit in the Brooklyn District Court, in the real world court, for a fraud action within Second Life. And yes, and you have tax issues
And it won't
now
be the
with
last
people
either.
making money, and you have IRS and tax issues. You have things like the stuff that Julian DeBell, I think is his name, has written about with rape in virtual worlds. So you have legal systems. You talk about human contracts. You have legal systems being built within virtual worlds, and some way of mediation or court systems. I'm really not sure. I haven't played in the legal environment within virtual world, but this stuff is spilling over now into the real world, into the court system, into the justice system, into the tax system, into the intellectual property legal regime. And where these lines get blurred, I'm just curious, those of you, and I have to say this, although this is perfect for Jaron, I actually would like to direct it to other members of the panel, because I'd like to hear their thoughts on this sort of blurred line.
Well, quickly, because that was a good comment in itself. It doesn't even have to be a question. Right, see, she's just take yourself.
Don't try.
I don't really know the details. I just know I read really about 2 or 3 weeks ago about a case that's being brought in the federal district court in Brooklyn. It is a fraud case for an action brought because of fraud in Second Life. That's all.
Okay, I have a comment. I've spent a lot of time in Russia and other places where the concept of intellectual property was totally weird, as opposed to private property was already a pretty edgy topic. And so, you know, fraud means if you deprive somebody of something they value. It doesn't matter whether it's a rock.
Fraud is misrepresentation.
Yeah, okay, well, so misrepresentation of how much the rock is worth, whether it's a real rock or a virtual rock. The moment you have money, real money, or money, game money that's exchangeable into real money.
Which is the case in Second Life, by the way.
Exactly. So I just don't see it as being quite that weird. It's certainly worth taking note of. But the moment you have things people value, rights to those things, those rights can be alienated, they can be misrepresented, they can be reassigned.
Well, what's interesting is it goes to Ken's point. I mean, we will have a lot of new arenas in which to figure out where we ought to apply changes in, you know, social norms and law that are, and it's happening at a very rapid pace, that we're being forced to reconsider these notions.
And in fact, one way to, in complete support of what you guys are saying, and to make it translate it so that, okay, it's not that weird, to explain why it's not that weird. When you said gold farmers making virtual objects and making money, and I heard this murmur like, wow, that's weird. And then what I'm thinking is Steven Spielberg goes and makes a movie. It's a virtual object. You're certain that when you spend your 11 or 12 bucks, you go into that, you get nothing. Nothing except a virtual experience that goes in your eyes and ears, and when you're gone, you've lost that money. It's a pure virtual experience. And yet, if someone in China starts duplicating that movie before it comes out, he can sue them for fraud, even though it's a virtual object. It's not that different.
Okay, but the one thing you get when you come out of that movie is you have a propensity to buy licensed objects.
Okay.
And that's actually really interesting.
Okay, right, but what I'm saying is it's within the same line of the same
real
thing.
quick.
A very brief answer to the question. The way I want to answer your question is I want to point out that different designs of online experiences seem to bring out different levels of good and bad behavior from people. And I'm particularly interested that there are a couple that seem to be really bad, like response roles on blogs really make people into jerks. So it seems, and I think one of the topics I'm really interested in that I view as an empirical project is understanding which of these designs seem to just bring out better behavior, and so it's an opportunity to try to create civility.
It's interesting as a journalist. You know, I read some of your writing, and you've mentioned this kind of thing quite a bit in what you've written. As a journalist, it's fascinating because almost no matter what you write today, if there's comments at the bottom, at least half will be pejorative insults toward you or toward the people you're writing about, and they're almost thoughtless, inane comments. And this is routine on the internet today, and yet many media like Fortune, which does it less than many others, but the comments are now presented in a space that is essentially almost equivalent to the original copy, which is produced by someone highly paid and disciplined, and then you have this bullshit that just sort of. But that's a brief. It's another case where we have not evolved the norms to adapt to what's technologically possible, and we need better blogging software, perhaps, or something.
We do, and we have
The
reputation.
woman here has been waiting to speak.
Okay.
Quite a while.
Yeah, we have reputation systems,
Apropos
David.
of the bullshit, and a lot of information on the internet being misunderstood or being given a lot of credibility that then people take as a serious thing. I was really struck by your comment about that having the technology is kind of like having a gun. Do you use a gun? No, you don't use a gun. Where you are saying childhood isn't really such an innocent time after all. There's the dark side. Well, along this week with the Facebook story was the story of an adolescent who killed herself
Right.
because of an incident on the internet where a mother,
Yeah.
because she was so disturbed that her daughter was being rejected by this girl, started I don't know what it was, some form of an email to this young 13-year-old girl using the persona of Josh. This is an adult mother. This girl fell in love with Josh. They had a passionate email correspondence, and then Josh wrote to her and said, I don't like you anymore, you're not a nice person, you shouldn't be around anymore, and you don't treat your friends well. And this girl picked herself up and hung herself in the closet. The mother who sent these emails has had absolutely no legal action taken against her. There is nothing in the courts, apparently, for this kind of thing to be going on. The people live on the same block, four houses down.
She has suffered social exclusion in her town, I believe, from what I've read about it.
Social exclusion. I mean,
No, I know,
that's
it's not
kinda like
sufficient.
the politicians and, the heads
No,
of
but then
companies
again,
are
what did
mad
she
at.
really do? That's hard to define.
This is the problem. You can be rude to somebody in the street, and they go and they kill themselves. I mean, it's
and in fact,
the internet is not at fault. It's definitely
well,
a
in fact,
tool.
I'd just like to preface it by saying it's a very tragic thing. This is horrible what happened to this kid, and yet at the same time, that's what happened. That's what this story, Dangerous Liaisons, which was written several hundred years ago, is precisely the same thing. It was just written letters.
Or Romeo and Juliet.
It's not about the medium of which physical way you do the fraudulent written communication. This kind of crime, social crime, whatever you want to call it, has been going on for centuries. This isn't even a new spin on this terrible thing.
I'm going to disagree slightly with my co-panelists and say that I think there's a question about the ethics of the level of anonymity we support in these designs. And I think that the girl who hung herself deserved more access to information to have a better sense of what she was dealing with. And there are various ways that could happen. It doesn't have to be absolute loss of anonymity. And yet I think the balance is too weighted against reality right now.
Yeah, that's
I mean,
a good point.
that wasn't anonymity. That was fraud. And someone said fraud is deception. This was deception.
I agree.
A woman was passing herself off as a sexy teenage boy, and it's evil. But I don't think this woman intended for the girl to kill herself. And so we should talk about this, but it's not a new phenomenon.
But a lot of evil is just people being
By
really,
mistake.
really
Yes,
stupid.
right.
Well, we have
when
to
they end
presume
up.
that people
And so it
have
still
evil
doesn't
in
get
their
them.
nature. We
Shouldn't
have
get
to-
them off the hook for it. But it's not about the recent technology.
But a number of the
It's
things
about-
we're discussing here are about where the borderline becomes gray between what we consider to be the real world and the technologically mediated world.
You have lowered the barrier to be able to create frauds on an almost unimaginable scale to the point that an idiot could trip over it. Okay, that's the problem. It's not that you couldn't do it before. It's now you can be a moron and do it. And the really bad news is the morons in the past couldn't pull it off. The morons today are likely to pull it off.
You don't have to write where they go.
Thank you. So what you've just done is you have handed them, by the way, a better gun and a moron can use, and the morons will use them. And the problem you've got is society has not caught up with the morons.
Well,
we don't. It's very difficult.
Do you think it will?
I'm not even sure it should. You got to be. There's an incredibly fine line between breaking the anonymity that you are entitled to and protecting those who need it. And you start messing with that, you've got to first figure out who needs it, which is an incredibly intrusive process. And then you've got to go protect them. So this is a huge challenge. I don't pretend, by the way, to have the answer other than that, yes, you are accountable for the actions, I would say, that this person took. That accountability needs to be in place because you have put out there an infinite collection of easily used weapons.
Okay.
And
let me ask a really specific question. Do you believe that this woman broke the social contract?
Definitely.
Okay.
Me too.
But it goes beyond that.
Well, we have a question here.
He was here, and then you'll get you.
Could you please? Our tech person has asked that the people speaking identify themselves. Actually.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Howie, and one of the things that have bothered me is the information that people can pick up on your medical records and things like that in advance, and that will leave you with the problem of, well, this guy's going to cost $1 billion or $1 million in medical procedures and things like that. We're not going to insure him. We're just not going to insure him. And that's one of the things. And another thing is you get all kinds of information and that is put on your health records, and they say, well, this guy is going to die at a certain point in time, and you know what it is, and you can check it. I don't want to get involved in that kind of thing. I'm afraid to I'll speculate that I'm going to live a long time, and I don't want to know anything that's going to interfere with it. But yes, the medical records of people are kind of sacrosanct. And it's more of like an Orwellian world here, where everybody knows exactly what you're going to eat, what you're going to die, where you're going to commit a crime, and do we send people to jail because the information that we have indicates that he's going to be a murderer or he's going to be a kidnapper or things like that? You know, it's kind of unsettling.
Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I'd like to take half an hour and respond, but I'll take 2 minutes. First of all, this is not happening widely. It's widely feared. Second, we do need to figure out what we want to do about paying for health care, separately from anything about the internet. It's becoming, we are rationing health care right now. We're rationing it in a very obscure, opaque way, partly by how much money you have, partly by who you know, partly by who your employer might be and what kind of insurance you get. The market is not clear and it's unfair, but it's not even clear how it is unfair. So that's the current situation. The fact that we know more and more about health records and that we're getting better and better at predicting outcomes means that the unfairness of it is becoming more visible. And I hope that that's going to lead to us making some kind of collective decisions, otherwise known as legislation, on how we're going to pay for health care. But I would also say that if I were a health insurer, I would much rather know when your parents died, how much you weigh, and how old you are, than anything else. Pre-existing conditions is obviously helpful, but it's much more complicated. Records that are electronic are probably safer than paper records. Records that are electronic, you can see who accessed them, you can see where they went. I personally had a doctor come to my office to give me an AIDS test, which I got in order to get a Russian visa. This doctor said, wow, I don't know you, but my boyfriend knows your name, and he's really excited because he's in the computer industry. And I wondered if she told her boyfriend the names of everybody she tested. So,
really interesting.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh, sorry.
I
Could
actually
you say your
have.
name
Identify
and
sorry.
what you do and your affiliations?
And my affiliations too?
Yeah, we want more
See, and you want my health record as well?
Yes.
I won't say what my weight is. But I'm Claude Shemtob. I'm a professor of psychiatry and pediatrics at Mount Sinai School of Medicine and a bit of an evolutionary psychologist. But I actually had a sort of what can we do question first, and then a comment. As you said, it is New York. We all have opinions. Strong ones, eh? My question is, are we, I see a convergence of games and virtual reality and any number of things, but I'm not sure that we're yet technologically at the place where we can bring all these together. If you go to the web, it's still an incredibly flat medium. It's mostly face pages. You add some chat rooms. You add some video now. But it's really a collection. And in games, you have a different thing where you have sort of the beginnings of a lived experience. I haven't been on Second Life. I'm wondering if, imagine, for example, a psychotherapist interaction. I'm wondering if people have gone to the point where they create an avatar with artificial intelligence, so that you have an avatar with whom you can interact, where you've actually got enough computing capacity to create artificial intelligence, so that if the person comes in and talks about OCD, the avatar can actually teach them about that. Right now, I think most of these things are very rule-bound, and they're fairly narrow sets of rules. It's not clear to me that they're driven by artificial intelligence level of things, and I wondered if you folks could comment about where the technology is. And then I'll make some provocative comments.
Well, I'll try to answer you very briefly on two levels. One is in terms of psychiatric applications of virtual reality. That's a tremendously successful field. And initially I was skeptical about 15 or 20 years ago when it was getting going, but the clinical results have been spectacular. And the principal areas are PTSD, where the paradigm is that
what is it? PTSD,
post-traumatic stress. It's the patient relives versions of the traumatic experience with an ability to gradually change the degree of trauma and become acclimated to it. And that's a very well validated system, which is in use in the veterans hospitals.
But it's nowhere near what we're talking about.
No, I understand. Yeah. So to your other question, I'm going to answer in a slightly cynical way, which is that you show me the artificial intelligence that your patient is talking to, and I'll show you the boundaries of the definition of psychology that patient will be stuck within. Or if you can find a naive enough patient to buy it, then you can always have AI. I mean, it's a very dangerous thing to write a program and say now we have captured what psychology is or should be. So I think as a starting point, it's a dangerous starting point, because you can confine yourself to the models that you use to build the virtual model of the person. I much prefer paradigms where you leave open the question of what people are and what they can be. That's my own bias, but.
And I think there's probably a social contract against it. It's probably illegal to have an AI operate as a practicing therapist.
Right. So let me make it harder for you then. Let's call it a teacher. I mean, all of this stuff is information. And the question is, what are the forms and how intelligently can you deliver information?
But there's a big difference between a simulation.
You can Google for obsessive compulsive disorder and you can get delivered
That's dead information.
therapeutic information.
It's not interactive in any real sense, is it?
Wait.
Well, that's okay. And maybe that my question is too specific.
Because there is work that goes on in interactive teaching systems, and one of the things that this is consistent with what everyone said so far is that we all have these fantasies from science fiction movies that there is some robot with some kind of simulacrum of a human brain inside of it that's actually using judgment, etc. But when you get down to practically trying to get things done, If you don't really have that in reality, maybe you want your interactive system that's embodying some artificial intelligence not to falsely look like a human face, suggesting incorrectly that it's the same as a person. You actually want that interactive system to accurately reflect to the person who it's interacting with. This is really not a person. This is maybe something that's checking your database, maybe answering some of your questions. But I think one of the reasons why people haven't gone strongly in that direction is it's very important when it's serious issues as opposed to entertainment to be as honest as you can about this is what I'm really presenting to you.
When I do online banking, I really don't want to see a fake teller. I just want to see the numbers of how much money I got.
Yeah, and those systems have failed where it matters. Those puppetry systems have failed because people are like, no, that's not a person. Yeah.
Although I should point out that this week there's an unfolding scandal in Russia where an algorithmic simulation of an online available babe is bilking Russian young men out of money, apparently pretty successfully. I heard the average rate was 3 credit card numbers taken per 5 minutes by this thing.
It sounds so Russian.
So you're saying the job is going to be...
Well, I mean, I think basically the answer, the moral of that tale is that young men are easily fooled.
On certain subjects,
real young women are losing job opportunities. Real young women are losing valuable job opportunities.
There you go. Let's go to the next question. Okay, yeah, over here.
Moving on.
And don't forget to identify yourself.
Yeah, identify.
Michael Sachs, I'm a retired attorney, and to, I guess, initially stimulate some interest into where I'm going, I think there's an obvious point that's come from the discussion that really hasn't been made. And the way it starts out with the comment about the lawsuits being brought in Second Life. And it's really connected, and I'm going to have to point because I don't really have the names. Certainly a very important point that you've made, which is that it's not really all about technology. It's about how humans behave and what they desire for the social contract. And the second point, again, I'm pointing once again, that relates to what I'm saying, is you talked about what people value and what people come to value. And what I'm really saying is that the lawsuits in Second Life are representational of the fact that the things that happen there are things that people value, which in effect makes it a real reality, not a virtual reality. And in a way, the obvious point I want to get to is that is it any different from having a part of the earth that's uninhabited, bringing human beings to that particular place, and having them begin to exist.
Australia.
And then everything about human nature and the need for law comes about. So what I'm saying hasn't what this technology has done is really created new space for human beings to exist, and consequently that space will have to have the normal constructs that then surround human life.
That makes sense, yeah.
Yeah,
that's a good point.
Absolutely.
I mean, but of course, there are some differences, which we all know, which is you don't actually have the opportunity to kill each other. You don't actually have the opportunity to have sex. You don't actually have the opportunity to share a meal in the same room and hand the food over to the other person.
But hope springs eternal.
You don't, I mean, let's get offline and meet, right?
Right.
Nice.
Okay. So over to this side. Who are you?
My name is Ronald Yeager. I'd like to just make some comment about sort of what I see in the future of technology. And what appears to be happening now, and we have to be very aware of this, is that we're right now at a precipice. We have the ability soon to engineer evolution. We can engineer evolution. And this is a very, very unique situation we're in right now. There appears to be at least 3 directions in which we are going. One is, of course, the people who are doing stuff with DNA, the bio people, are able to change genes and make new genes. Second direction that that is happening is a direction, of course, is sort of robots and other autonomous agents. We're building all these devices, and the third direction, which evolution is taking, is the direction of man-machine systems, where we're going to have systems that are going to be combinations of man. People are now doing research, for example, in which they're trying to communicate electrically between your neurons in your brain. So it seems to me that this is a very, very important issue that we have to concern ourselves with, because whoever's going to control this is going to control the future. And it's something we have to be very much aware of, is how this is going, because this is very important. I appreciate some comments on these people.
Anyone have any thought on that?
Well, you look
Yeah.
poised to say that.
It's no different from anything else. We have to be very careful about who has power in society. Whatever the particular tools of power are. Again, you could have half an hour of answers, but any concentration of power tends to corrupt those who hold it, and then they seduce those who have no power. And that happens again and again and again.
Yeah, people have had
nothing different.
Biological agents that could destroy mass parts of the population for years, and the power was there, but to some extent, rationality dictates that if you lose that power, you potentially destroy society. And eventually, one would hope they honestly went through and said, look, biological agents are a really bad idea, and have slowly taken them out of the stockpiles. My point is, these issues are faced by mankind forever, whether it's the invention of dynamite or people inventing nuclear devices. You hope that society has the feedback mechanism, which is what we've lived by all these years, where that feedback mechanism, just like we're going to see here, allows technology to leapfrog, because technology outruns society all the time, but society, as a feedback to it, then wraps itself around it and builds the necessary ecosystem to control it. And what you're describing is something that will in fact happen, but will in fact be controlled by the same societal forces that keep us from using things, to murder each other.
What controls society, for example, gentleman, I listened to him very, very carefully, and he's against what you made some very interesting points about the intrusion, loss of security, loss of privacy. Now, I'm sure you're for Bloomberg's. What do you think about Bloomberg's, idea of kind of being able to guard traffic? We're going to keep track of traffic. Now, without a doubt, that is going to be an intrusion in privacy. They're going to know everywhere you are. There's going to be cameras all over the place. It's going to know exactly where you are. Now, at least, if you sit in your car, you're somewhat, unless you have one of these things that you go over every bridge, but you're somewhat privacy. Now, every single movement of you is going to be known. This is an example. And so what happens, what drives this stuff is economics. Economics in war. The war in the attack on the World Trade Center has tremendously impinged upon our privacy. The government is doing things because...
I wanted to go back to the first thing you asked about engineering evolution.
Yeah.
I want to make a prediction, which is that, say 50 years from now, we're going to think of romance as the prior existing form of engineering for evolution, and that we're going to appreciate how sophisticated it was, and we're going to think that a lot of our new tools of direct gene manipulation and robotics and so forth are not as sophisticated because we don't currently appreciate what a remarkably sophisticated self-engineering scheme we already have for evolution.
Wow. Okay.
That's a really good point.
That's interesting too. Yeah, very interesting.
Wanted to,
and identify yourself, please.
I'm sorry, my name is B.L. Achman, and I'm a blogger and internet marketing consultant. I certainly agree that we've given up a great deal of our privacy in terms of our medical records and our, anything you put online, your credit card. But the other issue is that when we don't have to, people are still giving away information they don't have to give away. I for example, really, because I have a big audience and I'm aware of that, don't say, I'm going to this lecture. I'll say later, I went there. So I wonder if it's somebody's responsibility somewhere to address the naivete of people not realizing, you have to have some boundaries. I mean, and children, the 8-year-olds, we try to protect them within the little communities that they're able to be in. But whose responsibility is it to sort of teach people what they need to know?
Their parents?
Yeah.
Well, my parents aren't going to teach me. I mean, at 8 years old, yes, but I mean, the rest.
You mean
of us,
what they need to know in order to interact with what technology now makes possible?
well, to maintain whatever modicum of privacy still.
I would say the
exists.
responsibility rests with the prominent bloggers.
Well done. Perfect. Nicely put. Excellent.
So let's go here.
And the fortune columnist.
And the fortune columnist. Yeah, thank you.
My name is Andrew Brashatsky. I'm really interested in enlightened about this MySpace and Facebook, but having this audience here, having this panel here, maybe you could speak a little bit about where you think we're going 3, 4, 5 years from now, because stepping out of this world of just meeting people online, what technology will do for us and make our lives better 3, 4, 5 years from now, getting past this level that you've discussed?
I mean, it has stuff that's already here that most people haven't been exposed to. Trivial things like you have a camera and it's maybe intrusive and it's in a building, but if you have somebody who's elderly and infirm, if they were to fall down, you have programs now that recognize just by video extraction that this person has fallen, this person is unable to move, and summon help. Now, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't record the image. It doesn't in any way intrude on your privacy. But what it does do is it protects the individual who set this system up at very low cost. And it's being deployed at this point somewhat pervasively, depends on where. You have all sorts of technological aids, quote, which leverage the kind of intrusive technologies, potentially intrusive technologies, but we have people who spend their careers protecting you from them becoming intrusive. And so simple things like people drowning in swimming pools, it's a ridiculous thing. Why? Because a camera can detect when somebody, well, let's see, their head's underwater for 2 minutes and they're not moving. It's a bad sign. Nobody noticed. Well, you can pick this out. Why? Because a computer doesn't get bored and talk to its girlfriend or boyfriend while sitting on a lifeguard tower. It's paying attention. So there are things out there where very modest levels of intelligence, this isn't rocket science, but modest levels of intelligence enable you to do things that are unimaginable. You can watch a Mongolian broadcast of a television show and get a real-time translation because you have somewheres out there somebody's written a small translator that actually will put it up in script.
One thing that is near enough because it's just happening now that it's fairly easy to predict, and there are people making businesses right now about this, is, if you think about the Google Maps and, search capabilities and smart search and iPhones or their equivalent, right now, because it's so new, the combination of overlaying a virtual world on top of the real physical geographical world is still very, very underutilized. And so all around everywhere, people are trying to think of ways they could offer you services. It's not just, the restaurants or this or that, but the people I'm supposed to meet, and am I going to make that train, and all that. And actually, none of these things actually have to do with, there are so many of them that don't have to touch on your privacy. They're just tapping into the, what is the world around me, and it's a richer place. So bringing those two things together, which is just now beginning, and as you're pointing out, those things are actually going to get better and better because the bandwidth and the one thing that's not obvious is that as the computer chips get faster, it looks like you have better bandwidth because you're able to compress things. So even though you seem to have limits, it's actually your experience as a user, it's going to get faster and faster. And the point there is that that's going to be enormous impact on the convenience of being in a place like New York.
I'll give you. You give one quick, and I've got a couple things.
A very specific example. I was at Google 2 weeks ago, and you can go on Google Maps now, and you can say, well, how do I get from LaGuardia Airport to 247 East 82nd Street? And it will show you how to drive there. You're going to have a second option, and it's going to say take transit, and it will show you how to take transit. Now, not yet, but this is now working, but apparently not outside Google. In a few months, you're going to be able to say, well, where are the subway trains right now? Which one can I catch? What's my connecting time?
Well, that'll be useful.
It's going to be, but what's interesting is how that's going to change behavior. People who would be willing to take transit if they could actually predict how long it would take. Because it's too complicated to compute all the schedules, but Google can do it easily.
Let me just, it's interesting how much of this conversation has had to do with privacy. I find that fascinating. But I would just throw out two different things that I would respond when I hear a question like that. I mean, two really big macro trends that are obviously changing all of our lives, whether we realize it or not. Number one is the genuinely global deployment of technology and the arrival of computers even in the smallest villages around the world, and computer, cafes, internet cafes, accessible to anyone on the planet. And what does that mean for mutual awareness of our, how is that going to change the economic landscape? And I think it is changing it very rapidly as the awareness of the disparities in income start to really sink in around the world. I think that is happening at a very rapid pace because of the mutual visibility that now exists. And I think it also is changing the attitude in the developed parts of the world towards the long-standing disregard that we have had for the reality of life in the majority of the planet where people are extremely poor. That's one fundamental macro thing that I think is big to look at. And the other that's closely related to that is the deployment of mobile technology to literally everyone on the planet, and the fact that everyone is going to be carrying some kind of mobile device. And if you look at the rates of adoption of that kind of thing in India and China and Nigeria and Mozambique and Madagascar, you name it, everywhere, every single country in the world, the deployment of mobile technology is at an astronomical pace. And so then you really are bringing every single person on the planet into the communications infrastructure. And so in fact, I mentioned in this little description that we just recently passed the point where half the population of the planet has a cell phone. That was just within the last few weeks by one person's calculation, one company's calculation. So it won't be long before it's very close to 100%. And that is a really, really big transformative development, which we can't predict the implications of.
But I want to counter with it's really easy to see things, to get the world connected. It's much harder to change your mentality. So I want to tell an anecdote, which I warned against, of a Russian I spoke with just after Yeltsin came into power, and they basically deregulated all prices. This is a well-educated person. He was probably a programmer. That's most of the people I know in Russia. He watched CNN, and he said to me with great enthusiasm, "This is really wonderful. Our government is going to set free market prices, just like yours."
Yeah,
that's about par.
Great. Right.
Should we take one more question, David?
Yeah, sure. We'll take this and then we'll make it that the last thing.
Malcolm Fenton. I'm a teacher and geologist. I wanted to ask a question that's more intuitive than intellectual here, and that is that as we spend more of our time looking in computer screens and less of our time, at least in my experience, being out in the wider reality, what's going to happen to our connectiveness with nature? What's going to happen if, as I do, I spend time looking at images on Google Earth instead of being out on a glorious fall morning? Even though I know that walking out in that fall morning or walking out in the mountains is a completely different experience and gives me far more. So it's really directed to the members of the panel, all your immense experience. How do you see that going for us as humans?
I think we both tackled part of that question earlier, which is, at the end of the day, you have to get out of your damn chair and go see the person. You see, and there's that balance you need to strike, because otherwise you sit in front of an incredibly controlled environment. Frankly, you can tailor to your own phobias, which unfortunately will leave you even worse in the end. So there is that balance. It's not that one or the other. I don't see the extremes.
Can I respond a little bit to that, though? Because it's an incredibly seductive world, and especially for young people, where we have games like World of Warcraft, which are exactly what you say. You can tailor them, you can have your own avatar, you can begin to exist within that, and you gain a lot of satisfaction within that. So yes, I agree, life is balanced, and we know that from the Greeks, right? So but that's not what seems to be happening in many cases. That balance is being thrown out by the seductiveness and power of the technology that is being brought to us.
I would like to answer you, then maybe we will value nature more. But I think the truth is that just as our physical metabolisms are susceptible to sugar, and we eat more and more sugar even though it makes us sick, our mental metabolisms are susceptible to the empty calories of computer screens, and we will make ourselves sick on it, and it disturbs me.
But the other side of it is, I think it's not the Greeks. I think it's what I referred to before. It's before that. It's our own biological evolution. And kids do find, I've been watching this, kids are learning a lot of socialization and interaction on World of Warcraft, and they're clearly learning something because they're spending a lot of time there. But those same kids, I watch them, they go out and they run around in the yard also because they have to move their bodies. And their bodies tell them, and their mind tells them, I have to move my body. And kids, it's true, you can set up an environment where all you give a kid is sugar, but as grown-ups, we don't have to only give the kid sugar. And if we actually give them stuff that isn't just sugar, they have an internal instinct to run around in the yard.
On the other hand, I don't know how many people saw the article in the Times the other day about the re-education camps in South Korea for these very large numbers of young people who are so addicted to the internet, truly, that the government is now investing in these camps, paid for fully by the government, where they're taking large numbers of 18 to 30-year-old men, mostly, who are just being forced to go outside because they can't do it for themselves.
There's going to be a
parents wouldn't do it
it's amazing. Brace yourself for it. And I don't know how I feel about it, which is augmented reality, which is seeing virtual stuff and real stuff at the same time in the wilderness. And there are already some early experiments in this, but what will happen is kids will play virtual treasure games and stuff in Yosemite and whatnot. And it'll be both loathsome and wonderful at the same time in a very complicated
You mean they'll really be at Yosemite doing so?
And so, I mean, the thing is that there's going to be...
then it will get too crowded.
What'll happen? No, what'll happen is there's going to be a pseudo-wilderness. There's going to be an augmented wilderness, and there already is to a degree, but there will be to a much greater degree. And I really have mixed feelings about it, and I can't resolve them.
But also, is it fundamentally different from the same tragic trend that happened with television? And before that, one could argue related trend that happened with books, where you're exposed to this amazing world of information, and so kids are going to spend all their time reading or something horrible like that.
It won't be as good as books, but it won't be as bad as TV.
Okay.
Well, what I would say is that was a really good question to end with. And the answers are a really interesting way to end. Yeah. We obviously could have gone forever. We're going to take a couple-minute break, and then we're going to come back here, and Jaron's going to play some wind instruments that he's brought for us.
We had this thought, I also am a musician, I play unusual instruments, and we had this thought I'd play a little bit here, so I'm just going to do a really brief little show.
Okay, we should tell people to be quiet out there.
Yeah, tell us about the instruments, too.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe we should close the doors.
Yeah, just close the doors, that's easy enough. That's what they're for. As Ken so artfully pointed out. This is an instrument I just came across that had been stored without my having remembered it in the back room of a little music shop in the Lower East Side that just closed. I used to live here in the 90s, and I've been living in California for 6 or 7 years. And I just got a call from them saying, oh, we just found this thing of yours. And so I thought, well, great, I'll take it to this event. And I was kind of amazed it's still working. This is the first prototype of the computer in human culture, unless you want to count cuneiform. But which is older. But this is the first functioning object made of multiple parallel similar components. The first bits, if you like. That's an iPhone sound. I know that sound. Steve's got you. And so, this particular one's from Laos, but there are other similar ones that have been around for about 7,000 years, so far as we can tell. And it's a miniature organ, if you like. And in fact, it's the direct ancestor of the European organ. These were traded across the spice route. The ancient Romans created a giant version of this thing, operated by steam, much too big to actually play manually, so it was operated by an automatic mechanism. And that was a sort of probably a horrible sounding noise device that accompanied the gore of the Colosseum. And that thing, because it was automatic, turned into the early pipe organ, which amazingly, the early pipe organ was an automatic instrument, not a manual one. I mean, it was manual to a degree, but it was always automatic. And then that evolved into the automatic piano, the player piano, of which an amazing example was an improvising player piano that wasn't deterministic. Yes, this thing existed. And that inspired the Jacquard loom, a programmable loom for making fabrics, which in turn conceptually inspired the general purpose digital computing machine, and thus we make a living. Oh, this is a Khan, K-H-A-E-N. And then these are more and more unusual because they have privacy. They have evaded the internet. These are some flutes that resemble some things played in the backwoods of the Ukraine, or I guess it's Ukraine now. But I bought them off of some Hungarian gypsy boys who had apparently spent the afternoon breaking into cars on the East End of London. And they did not know the name. I have not been able to find any information about them. They are not named, but I know they were playing. What?
They're jokes. They're martial arts weapons. They're jokes. I use them.
You might want to use a different model than this if it ever really comes down to it, because these are pretty fragile. However, there are martial arts traditions with flutes, and that's a whole story. There are at least two I know about. And I have a 200-year-old Chinese flute with a concealed dagger. But even more interestingly was the Japanese shakuhachi, which started off as a Buddhist breath meditation instrument and was adopted by the ronin, the unemployed former samurai who needed a cover and became flautists and developed a martial art whacking each other with the things, and actually ended up being great musicians. They wrote most of the good classical music for it. But that is not this instrument.
It's like in a hall, you just... But you said that the Gypsy Boys demonstrated that thing for you.
Yeah, I have to say both of these styles are my own styles. I invented the styles. When I play this style in Laos or Northeast Thailand, it really strikes the people there as incredibly exotic. It's really like taking somebody who's been in a cloistered monastery their whole life and dropping them into Burning Man, I think. They just are completely unable to understand what I'm doing. And then this one, I'm using a style that's a little bit like a gypsy style I've heard on a single flute. I just made up the double flute technique entirely. I really don't know. The truth is these kids weren't very good at it. So they were probably better at breaking into cars. They seem pretty well dressed.
How would the native people play the other instrument?
This one? There are a few different styles on it. There's an almost folksy, it's almost like a banjo, let me see if I can. And it's kind of like this very simple, but there's a really cool, the coolest style in this, which I've recreated in a sort of a modernist way, accompanies boxing. And there's this really cool thing where they're musicians improvising to boxing. It's like really wild, yeah.
Is that tuned up like to 448 or is it?
Well, this one is like barely tuned. I really had a hard time getting this working, and I'd prefer to get it better tuned. This is actually not a good instrument. They are, these days, a lot of them tuned to Western scales. A lot of them do. There's a lot of variety there. We killed off most of it, unfortunately. Laos didn't take well to the Vietnam War era, but unfortunately, but there's still some variety, and you can find different tunings and older tunings. There are a lot of instruments in this family with different shapes and tunings. And
the interesting thing I found is that sort of, in a sense, it's like a piano. You have a right hand and a left hand. You're able to play chords simultaneously, or move on chords with one hand and lines on the other, and vice versa.
That's true. You can do all that.
Yeah.
And you could do that 7,000 years ago.
So what's happening? The air, you inject the air in and it goes up through the...
Oh, right. Yeah, exactly how it works. there are people who think they know how it works, and there's a guy who did a dissertation, which was a computer model of the inside of this thing a couple of years ago for physics degree, and I don't know. I mean, there's a couple of mysteries about exactly how it works. There are floating reeds inside here, and the mechanism is very simple. And there's like one idea of how it works is you cover the hole, and suddenly you've tuned this thing to be resonant with the reed, so it sounds where it wouldn't before. But the problem is, if you change even little things that shouldn't affect that, you screw it up. So it's a more complex mechanism. I had the honor of taking one apart one day with Richard Feynman to try to figure out exactly where it would break, and we never got it. So my current belief is that this is an intuitive technology that's never been fully understood. But I might be wrong about that at this point.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Further information about our programs and a complete archive of past Philoctates events is available at philoctates.org.